Hi, it's Rob from the Brush and Boltgun. Today I'm going to be doing a quick tutorial on how to paint a Nighthaunt Tomb Banshee.
The first colour we're going to use is Citadel Xereus Purple. I'm going to use this on the kind of bodice or corset. On the official miniature this looks a bit more of a brown colour than the purple I'm using, but I'm trying to get purple as a little underlying theme, so having a little bit of purple on most of the miniatures in the army just to join them all together regardless of how they look or how the ethereal parts are painted. So I'm going to be doing this in a sort of dark, dirty purple colour. Next up, we're going to be using Citadel Squig Orange, and we're going to be using this to do her hair. Now, if you haven't put the miniature together already, probably worth doing this before you put it together, at least the initial layers anyway, as it is quite difficult to paint some of the sections without getting it on the hands or the blade. There's a lot of layers going on, and it's quite difficult to get the brush in there. You can do it, but it is a bit awkward. So if you haven't put it together already, I'd recommend doing the orange and probably the shade before you put on the hair. Next up, we are going to be using a little bit of Vallejo Black. This is just a very quick layer, just to paint the inside of the mouth. You just get a little bit in the brush and get that painted in there. Like so. Now we have another very quick layer, it's Citadel Leadbelcher, and we're just going to be using this to do the blade on the knife. As I say, it's a very quick layer, there's only probably about 70% of the blade on show. Some of it's hidden by a hair on one side, a little bit hidden by hair on the other, so there's not really that much to do. Just be careful when you're putting it on not to go onto the hair. Get that done like so. Now to do the handle of the knife, we are going to use Vallejo Modeler Rust. Now this is like a deep bronze colour. I prefer this to the Agrax bronze that I've got as well. It's a bit darker. I think it looks quite nice as the handle of a dagger or a knife or a sword. Like so. Next up is Citadel Nihilakh Oxide. I'm going to use this to do all the ethereal parts of the Tomb Banshee. So you want to be aiming to get this a little bit thicker around the top where the creases are deepest, and then you want to get it going lighter down towards the bottom. So if you're painting it, drag the brush from the bottom to the top using a little bit of Nihilakh Oxide on the brush, and then once you get to the top you want to be letting that pool a little bit more. If you get to the top and there's not too much there, just add a little bit more so it's a bit darker in the deeper recesses. With that done, all the bases, we're now going to go onto the shades. So we're going to use Citadel Carroburg Crimson on her hair. This does darken it down quite a bit. I didn't want it quite as bright as on the Games Workshop version. I wanted it a little bit darker, a little bit moodier. So I'm using the Carroburg Crimson to darken that up. And when we start putting the layers on, you'll notice that it is ever so slightly darker. Next shade we're going to use is Citadel Agrax Earthshade. We're actually going to use this on the rust, Vallejo Modeler Rust, on the handle of the dagger. We're also going to use it on the bodice or corset, whichever you want to call it. I would usually use the Druchii Violet to shade this, but because I want it to be a bit darker and a bit dirtier and grimier, I'm using the Agrax Earthshade because that always darkens things up and always makes things look a little bit grimier. So I'm going to do the bodice in that, then highlight as normal. Now I'm going to use a tiny little bit of Citadel Nuln Oil. You're just going to use this on the blade of the dagger. Again, try not to get the Nuln Oil onto the hair. It's a darker shade than the Carroburg Crimson. It'll just be slightly more awkward to paint over. Once you've got that shaded up, you can move on to the next colour. I'm going to start working on the ethereal parts now, the ghostly parts of it. So we're going to start by painting up the long sweeping parts at the bottom. What I'll try and do here is try and almost keep it like I paint normally, so as though the light's hitting it, and trying to get more white on the wider areas and more of the Nihilakh oxide in the recesses and the darker areas. So you want to trace over the edges and try and just work a little bit of white into the dark areas so it kind of blends in a bit. It doesn't just give you a stark contrast where they are. If you can see a stark contrast, just try and kind of feather a little bit of white into those areas. If you want to see a full video on how to do that part, just let me know and I'll get one of them up. Next up, we're going to be using a little bit of Pallid witch flesh. I'm just going to use this to do the skin of the Tomb Banshee. So around the face and the arms and the hands. There's loads and loads of detail on the face. If you can pick that out with the Pallid witch flesh, that's sound. And if you wanted to add a little bit more brightness to it, you can add a layer of white to it as well. I just stuck with the Pallid witch flesh because I just wanted it to be ever so slightly different to the white. Give it a bit of distinction between where the, I suppose, ghostly flesh would be compared to the ghostly clothing. So I just stick with the Pallid witch flesh here. Next up, we're going to be using Vallejo White once again. And this is just going to be to paint up the eyeballs. It's another reason why I didn't want the kind of flesh to be too bright. You're just going to completely white those eyeballs, leaving some of the Nihilakh oxide around them. And then we're going to colour those, get them to look like they're glowing. Next colour that we're going to use is Citadel Xereus Flame. I'm just going to get a little bit of that on the brush, and you want to get that around each of the eyes and over the eyes. I mean, when you put this on, basically it'll show you the eye as though it's glowing a little bit. But then all we're going to do is add a little bit of white next, and that'll really give it that green glowing effect. So a little bit of Vallejo White. And get a tiny bit of this on your brush and just paint the very centre of those eyes there. That Xereus Flame does most of the work for you, as it does fade off from the eyeball because you painted them white previously. So just adding a little spot of white on the top there really does make it look like the eyes are glowing. So you can see here where I've kind of used a little bit too much white and blended those in together. So all we're going to do is use a little bit of Nihilakh oxide and just add some of that to that. And touch up some of the areas where you've maybe been a little bit overzealous with the white like I did. If you just do that to any of the areas that you think you may have put a little bit too much white on there, just go back over with a little bit of Nihilakh oxide, you'll be able to get them sorted. Now I'm going to use a little bit of Citadel Squig Orange. I'm going to start working on the hair again. Now I'm using a medium layer brush for this. You can use a thinner brush if you want to. All you're going to do is go over these individual hairs. I paint them like this. You can dry brush them. Be very careful either way because it's easy to get a splodge of paint in between the hairs themselves or the clumps of hairs. If you do that, just get a little bit of Carroburg Crimson, touch up the recess with that, and that'll be fine. Now I'm going to mix a little bit of Citadel Fire Dragon Bright with the Squig Orange. That's going to give us a slightly lighter highlight to put onto the hair. I didn't want to do a full Fire Dragon Bright on it because it is very, very bright. I wanted to keep it a little bit muted and a little bit dark. Again, I want to try and get the army looking a little bit moody because there is a lot of brightness in there with the ghostly colours, so I think the darkness of the hair and the bodice will stand out against them. So just mix a little bit of that with the Squig Orange and you can highlight that. If you do want to get brighter highlights on it, I'd do a layer of Fire Dragon Bright afterwards on the tips of it in the raised areas, but that isn't really needed too much. Now going back to Citadel Xereus Purple, we're going to start to recolour the bodice now. Despite it just looking like it's quite smooth and there's not much detail there. There are quite a few little grooves and lumps in there around the back and where it's sort of like creased together, so do try and catch them if you can. When you come to highlight them, try and catch them as well, just to make them stand out. Now we're going to use a little bit of Citadel Genestealer purple. We've actually mixed this with the Xereus purple, so it's not as bright a highlight as it usually would be. We wanted to again keep the colours a bit muted so they don't stand out too much. So when you see this going on, you can see that it is highlighting the areas, it is adding a bit of brightness to it, but not half as much as it would do if it was just the Genestealer purple on its own. So I'm trying to keep the colours a bit muted, a bit darker, so it's not too bright, so you haven't got the really bright highlights on it. We'll just continue with that and move on to the next colour. Next up, we're going to use a little bit of Vallejo Beige Brown from the Flames of War series. Just going to use this to do the chords on the front of the bodice. Once you've got those colours, we can move on to the next section. Next section is going to be Vallejo Modeler Rust again. We're just going to add a little bit of colour to the handle of that dagger. We'll get a little bit of shine, leaving the Agrax Earthshade in the recesses, like so. Now I'm going to use a tiny little bit of Citadel Agrax Earthshade, and it's just to add a little bit of darkness and grime to the blade. I'm going to get more of that towards the hilt, the dagger, like so. Now I'm just going to use a tiny little bit of Nihilakh Oxide. It's just to add a little bit of corrosion to the handle and the hilt of the dagger. You don't want to add too much because you don't want that blending in with the hands or the ethereal parts. So if you put a little bit too much on there, just take a little bit off, just so you've got a bit of discoloration, like so. The final colour we're going to use is Vallejo Modeler Chrome, and this is just to put an edge on the blade, maybe a few nicks and a few little highlights along the lines and the very tip of the dagger to make it look like it's been used a bit. And once you've finished these areas, that's the Tomb Banshee complete. That's the completed Tomb Banshee. See there, I've added some purple flowers to the bottom of it as well, which is another little try and blend in with the bodice and the rest of the army. But great little miniature. Another one's completed for the army.
Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and if you have, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future content. Also, think about subscribing to some of our other social media linked below. Thanks very much.